This is Lisa Miller and Associates, Florida Insurance Roundup, your podcast on the people, issues, and regulations shaping Florida's insurance market. Now, here's Lisa Miller.
Welcome, friends. High-risk flood zones are our topic today, and they are expanding this year along significant stretches of Florida's beautiful coastline, with consequences for insurance and property values. In South Florida's Broward County, home to Fort Lauderdale, the number of properties in high-risk flood zones has increased almost 60% to 90,000 properties. The really interesting part, about 80,000 of them were in such a zone prior to being removed 10 years ago during FEMA's last flood map revision in 2014. Now, these 80,000 property owners find themselves back in a flood zone, which means if they have a federally backed mortgage, which most mortgages are, they're now required to purchase flood insurance depending on the location of the structure on their property. Why? How did this happen? What's the science behind being in a flood zone, then not being in one, then being in one again? That's the subject of today's Florida Insurance Roundup podcast. To me, it seems further proof to something that some of my insurance colleagues and I have said for years, that if you live in Florida and your driver's license has that address in Florida, you should consider yourself in a flood zone, regardless of what a FEMA map says. Or I'll just put it another way. If it rains, it can flood. And it's not a question of if that water will come into your home. It's just a question of when. One of our guests today knows that only too well. He is Ron Hurtubise, business reporter for the South Florida Sun-Sentinel, and he lives in Broward County. And he witnessed last month's big flood and the April 2023 flood, both unrelated to hurricanes, but dumped inches and inches of water into that county. And he first reported a story about it. Ron, welcome.
Thank you, Lisa. Good to be here.
Glad to have you. Also joining us is Ron's other half, or Ron might say his better half, of whom I call the power media couple of South Florida. Ann Gegas, insurance reporter for the Palm Beach Post, one county north in Palm Beach County. Ann, so happy to have you with us.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
And from Fort Lauderdale is the keeper of Broward County's flood maps, Carlos Adoricio. He is the floodplain manager for the unincorporated Broward County, about 5,000 parcels, and the assistant director of the county's environmental permitting division. He's a professional engineer, a certified floodplain manager, and earlier in his career, he worked with the FEMA flood maps as a technical consultant. Carlos, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Hello, Lisa. Hello, everybody. I'm glad to be here.
So let's get started. FEMA calls these high-risk flood zones special flood hazard areas, SFHAs. The area designated on a FEMA flood insurance rate map as zones that begin with the letter A or the letter V for those living along the coast, subject to additional threat of storm surge. Properties in these zones, and many of you know this, supposedly have a 1% probability of flooding each year, or about a 1 in 4 chance every 25 to 30 years. Some refer to this as the 1 in 100-year flood probability. Ron, I want to ask you, because you're there, where are these nearly 90,000 properties that are now in a high-risk flood zone?
They're primarily located on the East Coast, from, say, Pompano down to the Hollywood area, and then they extend across the southern portion of Broward County into, I believe, Davie, Weston, and Miramar.
So when the floods hit, and you're covering these stories, and we'll get to some more of the technical issues in just a minute, do you go survey that damage? How do you report? What is it, some of the things you do, or do you stay in on the advice of emergency management officials when the floods come, like the however many inches of rain back last April and recently?
I have not gone out to personally inspect the flooding. As a matter of fact, I was working on the FEMA story, the story about the new properties that are going into the special hazard flood zone during that week. And it just so happened that Sunday was capped the week of the last 100-year flood. So it was fortuitous that more folks probably paid attention to the story and paid attention to whether or not they were going to need flood insurance because of that rain event.
And because of your very powerful story. And FEMA's revised flood maps for Broward County, they've moved only about 2,500 properties out of high-risk flood zones. So one of the things you mentioned in that powerful story that got so many people's attention is that you gave us even further proof that we can't take a FEMA flood map at face value. About a third of federal flood insurance claims nationwide are from people living outside these so-called high-risk flood zones. And before we get into the why of these changing flood zones, you also reported some of the latest figures on how many Florida property owners carry national flood insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program under FEMA. And you gave us the number of private insurance company policies and the total combined coverage. What are some of those numbers, Ron?
Well, actually, Florida has the highest number of properties with flood insurance in the country, and we have about half of the number of flood insured properties in the United States, 1.7 million of 3.4 million nationwide. So we're actually subsidizing the National Flood Insurance Program, if you will. But there's still 10 million properties, 10 million homes in Florida. So it's a relative pittance when you compare the number of properties that should be covered by flood insurance. South Florida, the Tri-County region, has 666,000 policies of the 1.7 million, which I think roughly corresponds to the population distribution down here. 76,348 properties were covered by private flood insurance, as of December 31st, according to the Florida Office of Insurance Regulation. So we're doing better than the country, but we're not doing as well as we should.
We have a long way to go, in other words. Carlos, turning to you. This on again, off again, high risk flood zone, where homeowners are in one for 10 years and then out of one and then back in one. You explain that in a document that we'll share in our podcast show notes. It talks about how coastal flood risk, there was a coastal flood risk study by FEMA that showed the changes in the flood zones and explained why the changes. Some of those reasons for our listening audience is that the maps incorporated new hurricane modeling that replaced some outdated models. It incorporated updated elevation data, recent storm data, and significant development in the area that would change the rain runoff, which would make sense. It explained a greater ability to more accurately define current risks for flooding along Broward County's 25 miles of coastline. But I get all that. I do. I just was wondering how of the nearly 90,000 properties that just moved into a high risk flood zone, that almost 80,000 were in such a zone 10 years ago, and now they're back in. Can you just give me some of your thoughts about that, being the expert in this area?
Sure. So the FEMA maps really reflect two risks, the risk of rainfall and the risk of storm surge. So back in the 80s and 90s, they did studies for both, for the rainfall and for the storm surge. And so those maps reflected that study. And at the time, most of the county was within the special flood hazard area or the 100-year floodplain. So back in 2014, FEMA updated the maps, but they only updated the portion for the rainfall risk and not for the storm surge. And then because from the 80s to 2014, there was a lot of development, there were better modeling. What happened is a lot of the areas that were in the floodplain, 100-year floodplain, were removed. And now in this 2024 update of the maps, FEMA is only updating the coastal flood risk. That means the storm surge. So, and the last storm surge was done in the 80s. Again, there's better mapping, more development. You have better computer capabilities, so better modeling techniques. Therefore, in this update, they're just reflecting that storm surge. Now, one of the components of the storm surge is the sea level, which is higher than the sea level that they accounted back in the 80s. And therefore, the storm surge is higher in this new study, and being higher, that inundates more properties when that 100-year storm surge comes through the county. And now the southern part of the county is lower than the middle and northern section of the county. And then if you have a higher storm surge, and now it's to the point where FEMA believes that higher storm surge elevation not only goes to I-95, it goes all the way to US 27, which is close to the Everglades levee. And that's why you have those almost 90,000 parcels that are increasing in flood risk, because now they're in the special flood hazard area. And then when you compare to the ones that were removed in 2014, about 80,000 of those 90,000 were removed in 2014, and now they're back in the 100-year floodplain.
So, Carlos, oftentimes these maps are as granular as where the structure is placed on the parcel. You know, for example, if someone owns an acre lot, maybe their house is in the front of the lot, or maybe their house is in the back of the lot. Can you talk about how that affects a FEMA flood zone?
Sure. So when we talk about the almost 90,000 parcels that are added to the flood insurance, the way the county did the analysis is they look at the entire parcel, and then if the parcel has a portion or all the parcel within that special flood hazard area or 100-year floodplain, it was determined to be in the floodplain. So the flood insurance requirement is for the structure or the home within a parcel. And the home may be just in the northern part of the parcel or in the middle. But if it just so happened that 100-year floodplain is touching the parcel, but not the structure itself, then the flood insurance requirement will not be there. It's still recommended that that homeowner buys flood insurance, but it would not be mandated if you have a federally backed mortgage.
And you're hearing Carlos talk about Broward County, the risks that are in, the risks that are out, the risks that are back in. What is your experience in Palm Beach County with some of your readers? What do they say about, recent flooding? You cover a lot of property insurance, homeowners insurance.
I think a lot of people don't realize that they're not covered for flooding until they have an emergency, like we heard about in Hurricane Ian, that a lot of the damage was not insured because they were not coastal areas that knew that thing about, if your driver's license says Florida, you need to have flood insurance. I believe the state figures are that only 18 to 22% of people have flood insurance. But what's interesting in Palm Beach County is that the building officials, the county building officials there, are fighting back against the new FEMA maps that came out. And they actually, on July 9th, approved some funding that could eventually result in another map that shows that the higher elevations will that there are new higher elevations that the new maps required. They're fighting against them. They're also fighting against the inclusion of a little less than 6,000 new people in high-risk flood zones. So that's going to be interesting, whether they can override what these latest maps have said.
So let's think about this among the three of us. We have a mapping system, and maybe Carlos can comment about this, where experts create the maps. There is sometimes input as the maps are being created, sometimes not. The maps are released every several years. Then the communities most times don't like the maps. They fight the maps. And then the maps are under scrutiny. What is that process, Carlos? Tell us what that is.
Well, usually when FEMA is doing a restudy of an area, they go through a process. They do outreach to the communities, informing them that they're going to start a new flood risk study, either riverine, the rainfall, or coastal, the storm surge. And then they solicit input, they solicit data, and that's provided. But FEMA has a consultant working on that new study. And then that consultant does the analysis. They usually, what they map is the 100-year floodplain, or the floodplain that has a 1% chance of being flooded on any given year. And so they put out preliminary maps that they present to the community, and the community at that point has a chance to comment on that product, on that preliminary product. And then many times they don't agree. And actually in Broward County, Pembroke Pines, which is located basically between the turnpike to the US 27, they're very well inland from the coast. Those preliminary maps show that their area the storm surge was going all the way there. They disagree, and then FEMA heard the disagreement, and they have a process called appeal, and Pembroke Pines community appealed those preliminary maps, but FEMA ultimately resolved that their maps were accurate, and then they were going to reflect that new floodplain in those areas. So that's the process that they follow.
Can I ask Carlos a question?
Sure.
When we talk about storm surge, most people think from the ocean during a hurricane. In South Florida, though, isn't it true that storm surge can rise from underground as well?
Well, the storm surge, what it does, it raises the level of the water in the ocean, and then that water, that dome of water, travels with the storm, and then gets inland. So you could have a situation where the water that has risen so high, it could be going underground, because our ground is limestone, and limestone is porous. The water could travel underground through that limestone. And then if you have an area that has ground elevations that are lower than the storm surge, you could potentially have water coming out through the ground. I haven't seen that in Broward County myself, but it is a possibility, given that the ground is limestone and is porous.
But is that part of what FEMA is mapping, that potential for water to emerge from underground?
Okay, so when FEMA does the mapping or the study for the storm surge, all they're doing is they're modeling the dome of water moving through the ocean and then inland, and then they also add to that the windstorm. Now, when you do the riverine analysis, you would account for groundwater, but the studies are done separately. So in this case, what FEMA does is they get elevations from the storm surge, and then with those elevations, they look at the ground elevations, and depending on those, they will determine the water will move into certain areas or not. Now, the specifics of the modeling, I don't believe that when they do the storm surge and they have that water rising, say, on I-95, their model for the storm surge does not include a component that shows, oh, let's see groundwater moving under and showing out up in US 27. Their model mostly looks at just ground elevations. If the elevation of the ground is lower than what they've determined the surge, they determine, okay, that area will be covered by the storm surge. So it's the water travel over land instead of under the ground.
All the way from the ocean to US 27.
Yeah, in this case, they determine that the areas where South Florida Water Management District has the coastal structures, they determined that the elevation around those coastal structures was low enough for the surge of water to go over that and then move west, and then as far west as US 27.
Wow.
So, Ron, that seems to be an aha moment for you because I live in North Florida, not South Florida. Give us your perspective about why you think that might be, what's the word I'm looking for, unbelievable?
Well, US 27 is all the way, isn't it west of Weston, Carlos?
That is correct, but the storm surge, the elevation of the storm surge, it could be anywhere from 6 to 8, depending on where you are in the county. And in the southern part of the county, the FEMA determined to be close to 6, and the ground elevations there, they're lower than 6. And because the ground elevations are lower than 6, then the storm surge is determined by FEMA to have moved all the way to US 27.
Now, do I understand correctly that you're saying that these latest flood maps are not determined by rainfall estimations, just storm surge?
Well, okay. So the maps include two components: the rainfall and the storm surge. Okay. So the way they've done it is this time is they only updated the storm surge portion because the rainfall portion was updated in 2014. So when they do the analysis, in essence, in a simpler way, it's like, okay, what is the 2014 elevation according to the rainfall? Say they determine is 7. Well, the storm surge is 6. Now the riverine controls, and then they will put on the map the 7. Whereas if the 2014 maps riverine information says, okay, the elevation is 4.5, but then the surge is saying that the elevation is 6, then they will put in the map elevation 6 because that's higher. And that's simplifying how they do it. But that's a simple way to explain it, so a layman can understand what FEMA process is.
Even with this conversation, though, listeners, I'm hoping that you see that whenever Carlos talks about a flood map that was, quote, updated in 2014, that map is still 10 years old. So it really reinforces that it doesn't really matter what the maps say. Not that I want to discount the importance of them, but we know for fact that people are flooded in X zones meaning the lowest risk of flood. And we know that those zones certainly need coverage as well. Going back to Ann, oftentimes we hear the term South Florida flooding. And I was curious, what is distinct or what is unusual or what is it that those that live in Palm Beach, do they think they flood less than in Broward County? Do they think they're better than Dade? I mean, what is it? You've been in that area about a year, a little more than a year. I'm just curious if you have any perspective on that and if they're taking seriously, maybe more seriously than the rest of South Florida flood issues.
Well, I think the municipalities are doing a lot to get ahead of the problem. I believe that Delray Beach is about to start a new pumping station that's going to be able to pump some 4 times the amount of the current one, that their main pumping station. So they're really taking it seriously in terms of trying to, be prepared for what's coming, I think. Of course, there are some who would argue that Palm Beach County thinks they're superior to all of Florida, but anyway, I would say that the municipalities are very well in tune with the problem, I'd say, from the meetings I've been at and the conversations I've heard between elected officials.
That's encouraging. I follow the federal funding coming into Florida, the resiliency funding that is pouring in. I don't know if it'll ever be enough to make the communities more resilient and to reinforce the infrastructure against flood, because it's fast approaching. We talk about the difference, the storm surge versus the rainfall. A lot of times it is just the inundation in and of itself. Carlos, I'm going to close with you. Any closing comments? I know you walk the highways and byways of Broward County with this new revelation of all these people going back into flood maps. Any pearls of wisdom? And I'll ask our other two guests as well before we close.
I think what you said, the lowest risk of flood is the zone X, and in the word in there it says flood. So it's just low risk. There is a chance, small, but a chance that that area could flood. Therefore, the best thing that the homeowner can do is try to get flood insurance, so they're able to repair any damage should a flood affect them. So that's the best advice that we can give to everybody. Doesn't matter which flood zone you are, buy flood insurance, because the entire South Florida is a flood zone.
Thank you so much for that, Carlos. Ron, with your great research and that article that you were writing as the flood was coming in, give us your final thoughts.
Well, Ann and I live in a town called Margate, and it's in roughly the north central part of Broward County. And we've been in an X zone for as long as we've been here. And we've purchased flood insurance for as long as we've been here, about 12 years now. It started out around $300 and it's gone up to about $600. And compared to the spiraling cost of home insurance, I think it's a bargain. And when we do get a lot of rain and I see the water bubbling up from the storm sewers along the major roads, I say it could happen to us, regardless of what zone we're in.
So true. Anne?
Yeah, sometimes it's even just a blocked sewer grate is enough to make it look like, oh boy, you better not drive here. So it really does make sense, I think, to be prepared for what's coming and be aware that these big storms that we're hearing, where they say it's a 1,000-year storm, it seems like a 1,000-year storm keeps showing up, even though it was only a couple of years ago. So I think that it's definitely something people should be cognizant of.
One of the worst areas of that Ian flooded a couple of years ago was in Central Florida, Volusia County, Orange County, that area. And that's well inland, and you wouldn't think that you would be susceptible to storm surge, but Ian was a rainmaker, and it rained a lot. And most of those people didn't have flood insurance.
On our next show, we're going to talk about creative ways to help people afford flood insurance, or to show them that, Ron, I think you said your premium annually is less than $1,000 a year for flood.
Yes.
And that we should look at the cost of our cable bill and our cell phone bill, or, those, maybe some of those luxuries might not be so luxurious if we anticipate a flood. But with that, I just kind of want to thank our guests, certainly, and grateful for their listening today. And Ron, thank you so much for being here. And Anne, the two of you, what I often say, doing the Lord's work, educating readers, working in the media, bringing the news. Thank you both for being here.
You're welcome, Lisa. Maybe next time we could talk about citizens' requirement that people buy flood insurance.
We certainly can.
And the discounts that you can get if your leaders do the right thing to mitigate the flood risk.
So true. All the good things we can do to make our homes stronger or structure stronger. Carlos, a big thank you to you. I know you are working as Broward's floodplain manager. People don't even know what a floodplain is. I just think of it as a piece of land that can flood, really. But you just explained it so easily to understand how these maps work and why they changed.
Yeah, no problem.
We're doing all we can to bring about flood awareness and what flood insurance is and why it's so important. And so much so that, when the legislature did mandate flood insurance for certain personal lines policies in Citizens Corporation, there's been much discussion about that, why that happened, and how that's rolling in. We may have a guest from Citizens help us understand. Fannie Mae, as you know, they've had a recent consumer flood risk awareness study that notes that Fannie Mae is considering some strategies to address the challenge of increased flood, maybe expanding flood insurance requirements, promoting an all-peril policy that covers both property and flood, and it just goes on and on. It's a great piece of work. These property insurance policies don't cover flood, as we talked about, but we will certainly put in our podcast show notes the link to the Broward County Coastal Flood Risk Study that we want you to pay attention to, even if you're not in South Florida. For those of you that are in the insurance industry trying to keep up with it, all eyes should be on South Florida and its flooding issues as a way to educate ourselves in other areas of the state. We hope that we can hear from you. We always want to hear about your experiences and what your thoughts are. Call us at 850-388-8002. That's 850-388-8002, or send me a note at Lisa Miller at lisamillerassociates.com. You can follow us on X, formerly Twitter, our Facebook page, LinkedIn. Be sure to hit like or follow on your favorite podcast platform so you won't miss a future episode. And we hope that you will share our good work with your colleagues and friends. I can't go anywhere in airports or even in small town hall meetings where someone hasn't heard something about some of our conversations or the newsletters that we do. So we appreciate your constant support. I just appreciate you being a part of the Florida Insurance Roundup and these great guests today. And remember, at our firm, Lisa Miller & Associates, we've got a great passion for public policy and a client success, as well as your educational awareness of great topics. So I'm Lisa Miller, and I appreciate all your listening time. Until next time, stay safe.
This has been Lisa Miller & Associates Florida Insurance Roundup, your podcast on the people, issues, and regulations shaping Florida's insurance market. For more information on today's program, please visit us on the web at www.lisamillerassociates.com.